Hello, I'm Dahl Russell, and today I'm going to be sharing some research and insights into the life of George Frederick Handel and his Messiah. He was born Georg Friedrich Handel, spelled with a C, also spelled Georg Friedrich Handel, Friedrich with a CH, and Handel with an umlaut over the A. Also spelled Handel, sometimes in Germany, Handel. He was born February of 1685. He was born the same year as Johann Sebastian Bach and also Domenico Scarlatti. Later in life, he moved to England and became an English citizen and anglicized his name to George Frederick Handel. He is a composer of the late Baroque era, noted first as a musician, organ, harpsichord, and violin primarily, then as a composer for his operas, later his oratorios, and instrumental compositions. He wrote the most famous of all oratorios, Messiah, in 1742, and is also known for such instrumental pieces as The Water Music, 1717, and Music for the Royal Fireworks, 1749. His parents were Georg Handel and his second wife, Dorothea Tost, the daughter of a Lutheran pastor. Handel's family roots were firmly based in trade. Definitely not poor, but not rich, and definitely not aristocracy. His grandfather had been a coppersmith, married to the daughter of a master coppersmith. Handel's father was the third son, and since his elder two brothers had followed the family profession, he was trained to be a barber. We also often see him referred to as a surgeon because he was that too. Today we tend to forget that being a barber in this time period also meant being the town surgeon, including both dentistry, doctor, and surgeon. This, of course, throws an interesting light on Sweeney Todd, the demon barber of Fleet Street, and his sideline as butcher for meat pies. Very briefly, from the 1600s, there were three types of doctors: physicians who were trained in university and who were more theoretical, barber surgeons who did the practical trade training, and this is what Handel's father did, and pharmacists who were considered a completely separate trade. It was not until the 1760s that medical licensing became required, a year after the death of our composer. Father Georg was also a tavern owner, very convenient for anesthesia. You will also see the father, Georg Handel, referred to as a valet or valet, but it is important to note that he was not someone's house servant handing him his cravat in the morning as he dressed. This seeming incongruity between being a valet and being a tavern owner with the trade of barber-surgeon is clarified when we see that Georg was so highly respected in his profession and within the town leadership that he was appointed by Augustus, Duke of Saxe-Weissenfels, to the positions of court barber-surgeon and Kammerdiener, court valet. So it's important for us to know that our composer's family were based in trade, but also highly regarded and ambitious. And this explains why his father wanted him to go to law school. It was the next step up, away from trade, from the previous generation, the hot, sweaty, menial job of coppersmith, to his father's job of barber-surgeon, which was still literally hands-on, to being a lawyer, which meant going to university and not having to get your hands dirty, literally. But importantly, in this time period, still considered a trade, which is important in a family of proud trade lineage. Conversely, musicians were still considered servants. Even a generation later, Haydn was still wearing a servant's uniform called livery. Musicians in some households actually held dual positions as servant and musician. He serves your dinner, and then he plays you the violin after your dinner. So armed with this understanding, we have a much better idea of why Georg did not want his son to become a musician. And when his son, as a toddler, showed interest in music, he forbade musical instruments from the house. Now, the anecdote is that his aunt arranged to have a harpsichord secretly brought in and put in the attic, presumably at least 2 floors above the family bedrooms, and that this very young Handel would go up and play at night when the family was asleep. It is the very rare toddler indeed who is driven to practice in an attic late at night. When he was 5, the family visited one of the older brothers from the father's first marriage, working as a butler for the house of Duke Johann Adolf I. When some music was being performed, he sat down and played some music himself, playing well enough at 5 that the Duke gave Handel's father gold coins for Handel to study music. This put Father Georg in a bind, because to refuse would have been an offense to the Duke. So, young Handel began his official training in keyboard and composition from organist Friedrich W. Zachau. He also played violin and oboe. Handel's father died when he was 11, but his father had been successful and Handel's education was provided for, and in 1702 he did enroll in law school. At the same time, he had a job as a church organist. Neither of these stuck, really, because within a year he was playing in the violin section of the Hamburg Opera Orchestra, and some of the duties of harpsichordist on the side. This did stick. In 1705, just 3 years later, he was at the harpsichord conducting and directing his premiere of his first opera, Almira. Handel has a rare place in the pantheon of musicians as someone whose work was both beloved by audiences of his day, and at the same time he had respect of the musicians of his day and after his time. Bach, a contemporary, was quoted as saying, "Handel is the only person I would wish to see before I die, and the only person I would wish to be, were I not Bach." Beethoven said, "Handel was the master of us all, the greatest composer that ever lived. I would uncover my head and kneel before his tomb." Beethoven was often found to be very emotional. It is worth noticing that part of Handel's fame was driven by his drive to move around. Consider, for comparison, that for almost 100 years after his death, Bach's work was almost entirely forgotten. Bach stayed basically in one place in his church jobs, renowned in his country during his lifetime. But had it not been for Mendelssohn's interest in and understanding of the importance of Bach's work and his intentional resurrection of Bach's music into performance, Johann Sebastian Bach could very well have remained an obscure organist composer. But much like Mozart in a later time period, Handel moved around. With his success at the Hamburg Opera, he did not become entrenched there. Instead, he went to Italy. He had the drive to go to the place that was considered the best at opera in this time, and he had the artistic ambition to want to continue improving his work by learning and working in the arena that set the standard. Just 1 year after his astounding success with his first opera, he was traveling to Italy, meeting with the great Italian composers of the day, including Arcangelo Corelli, Alessandro Scarlatti, and his son Domenico Scarlatti. He traveled and worked in Italy for 4 years, composing and performing 2 operas, cantatas, oratorios, and Latin church music. So 5 years after the premiere in Germany of his first opera, in 1710 he premiered his opera Agrippina in Venice. Now, we will never really know if this was an intentional, calculated business move on his part to try to establish himself internationally, or was he just flowing with the tide, or a bit of both, translating to his fate. Certainly, there was no guarantee that a German composer would have any success in Italian opera, but he did show up. And whether by calculation or an innate sense of the current tides, or by fluke, this was not the last time that Handel would show the ability to observe what was going on and happening elsewhere, and then to incorporate it into his own work in a new way that brought him unexpected success. What he may have hoped for is what happened. His success in Italy made him famous throughout Europe in a way that success in Germany alone would not have. He was now internationally famous. That same year of his success in Venice, 1710, back at home in Germany, he is appointed Kapellmeister to the Elector of Hanover, who was next in line for the British throne. And later that year, Handel traveled to England. The next year, his opera Rinaldo was performed in London and greeted enthusiastically. The year after that, he returned to London again for the production of another of his operas, another success. The year after that, 1713, he won his way into royal favor by both his Ode for the Queen's Birthday and a work in celebration of the Peace of Utrecht. And he was granted an annual allowance of £200 by Queen Anne. Now, the information that I found is that £1 in 1700s is equal roughly to £4,000 today. That would make his allowance from Queen Anne roughly the equivalent of £800,000 a year. As I mentioned before, even as Kapellmeister to the Elector of Hanover, he was still a servant, with innumerable composition and performance duties, large, small, and sometimes tedious and thankless. From an artist's standpoint, the grant of an annual allowance from Queen Anne was something else entirely. Independence and the ability to work as he wanted to on the things he was interested in, with enough funding to easily establish his own opera company. He wanted to stay in England. And the next year, 1714, Queen Anne dies, and his German elector now became King George I of England. Except for a few visits back to Germany, Handel stays in Britain and became an English subject in 1727. That official change in his nationality made him able to be appointed a composer of the Royal Chapel. Now, time for some dish. Or not, as the case may be. You may have noticed I have said nothing about Handel's personal life. There is almost nothing known. We know more about Vivaldi's personal life, and we know very little about that. Some biographers today infer that the silence means he was gay. But the only proof they can point to of this is that some of the wealthy people who commissioned works from him were known to be gay. But that's really quite a far leap of assumption. One of his patrons was Queen Anne. That didn't make him royal. That didn't mean he was a woman. We simply don't know what we don't know. As an opera composer, director, producer, certainly he had daily access to women with a reputation for low morals. We do know that he had a pretty low opinion of women. Brahms frequented brothels, and he also had a low opinion of women. But a low opinion of women was the norm for all men in this time period, and a low opinion of women was the norm throughout society, even amongst other women. We do have the one famous contemporaneous anecdote about the opera singer that he thought was being difficult and demanding, and he hung her by her feet out the window. Let's unwrap that a little bit. He wasn't Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. He was a pudgy composer-musician. Do we really think he could have held a struggling Italian soprano, not known for being slender, out the window by her ankles without dropping her? Maybe not. How about they had a screaming row, which everyone down the block heard, and he pushed her towards the window while she screamed, and he threatened to throw her out? More likely. Also, very likely, that he, as a producer, and she, as a performer, knew how to make the most publicity out of the event after it was over. Food for thought and a lesson about even contemporaneous anecdotes. Now, that anecdote is really the most specific information from his time period that we have about his relationships with women. And we have no information about interactions with men. George Frederick Discretion Handel. As someone who reads a lot of composer biographies, I want to remind everyone that when we don't know something, we just don't know. Assumptions or innuendo only cloud the field. And that's a good thing to remember for today as well. When innuendo is contemporary from the time period, it does mark a possibility, but even contemporary gossip can be wrong or intentionally malicious. Biographers too often see a blank and can't resist filling it up with a little story. Archaeologists warn that a blank is just that, a blank, and we need to be very careful to leave it blank until we know verifiably what is there. So, as for Handel's personal life, we just don't know. Back to work. From 1720 until 1728, the operas at the King's Theatre in London were staged by the Royal Academy of Music, and Handel composed the music for most of them. As happens today, the taste in popular music changes over time, and Italian operas were becoming a bit of old news. The British public was certainly getting tired of an entertainment form that was in a foreign language. They were also getting tired of hearing about the behavior of the Italian performers, who were considered by the Brits to be loud, obnoxious, and immoral. Perhaps because of these currents in public taste, in 1728, a production took place that shook Handel's career and everyone else in the theatrical establishment, and also gave them a good solid poke in the eye. In 1728, John Gay's The Beggar's Opera was produced and caused a sensation. It combined political satire with an irreverent satire of the established Italian opera. The music was actually from songs and operas of the day with melodies that the general public knew, including melodies by Handel. But these works were not being sung by rarefied opera singers, but by popular theater actors who could sing, with new lyrics added, lyrics in English that could be easily learned and sung with these well-known tunes. The Beggar's Opera portrayed the lives of a group of thieves and prostitutes in 18th century London. John Gay caricatured the government, fashionable society, marriage, and Italian operatic style. Particularly evident are parallels made between the moral degeneracy of the opera's protagonists and the contemporary high-born British society. This was a blow. It was not a death knell for Italian opera in England. For another 10 years, Handel continued writing and producing operas with his company. He also continued writing instrumental works and working in a form that was gaining popularity, the oratorio. Oratorios had the advantage of they didn't need a set, they didn't need costumes or staging, simply the rehearsal and presentation of the music. Now, the year that Handel's opera company folded, 1737, Handel had a stroke that paralyzed his right arm and stopped him performing for a while. This would not be the first time that people thought his career had ended. But no. After a period of treatment and recuperation in Germany, this was the year that he wrote his 12 grand concertos, Opus 6, and helped establish the Fund for the Support of Decayed Musicians, now known as the Royal Society of Musicians. And that same year, he also composed two of his most famous oratorios, Saul and Israel in Egypt, both of which were performed 2 years later in 1739. Now, it's probably not a coincidence that the fate of decayed musicians was on Handel's mind. The last few years of keeping his opera company afloat, his stroke, had left him largely in debt, so much so that he fled London to Dublin to escape his debtors and also to escape debtors' prison in London. In 1741, a friend of Handel and wealthy arts supporter, Charles Genin, asked him to set his libretto to music for an oratorio, and as with most oratorios, the text was biblical. The work was intended for Easter time. The texts were drawn from 3 parts of the Bible: Old Testament prophecies of the Messiah's birth, New Testament stories of the birth of Christ, his death, and his resurrection, and verses, ultimately relating to Judgment Day, with the final chorus text drawn from the book of Revelation. Now, despite his previous work in churches and having had success with the oratorio form, Handel had not been particularly known as a religious man. Certainly as a composer, conductor, and producer of operas, he would have been considered very much not. It's fairly easy to assume, though, that with most of us, having been raised with religious training, with age and infirmity, his thoughts of what comes after and thoughts of religion became more important to him later in life. It is clear that Jennings had the intention for Messiah to be evangelical. Jennings also made it known later that he was not happy with Handel's work. But regardless of Handel's initial intention, it became clear that the work was also explicitly evangelical for him as well. He composed it in 3 weeks in a tempest of inspiration, working all hours, eating little and sleeping little, to the point that his friends were concerned about his welfare. Handel later said himself that he felt he had been inspired by God in the composition of the work. Also evangelical was his decision to hold the premiere not in a church, but in a theater. And instead of using opera singers, he used actors who could sing. Sound familiar? This was 12 years after the Beggar's Opera, but Handel had learned the lesson about ways to make a work popular beyond the walls of the church, and also as a potential tool for evangelism, evangelizing the actors working on the piece and evangelizing the secular audience. Normally, Handel's oratorios would have had a combined number of singers, chorus, and orchestra of about 40 to 50 people, and the premiere of Messiah was much the same, a combined total of around 60 performers. Not only was it held in a theater, but women were specifically asked not to wear hoop skirts so that more people could be seated. 700 people attended the premiere in Dublin on April 13th, 1742. Handel arranged to donate his proceeds of Messiah's first performance to 3 charities: the Charitable Infirmary, Mercer's Hospital, and the Society for Relieving Prisoners, specifically debtors. It was a great success, and due to that and the funds that it brought in, approximately 142 debtors had their debts paid off and were released from prison. When the backers heard about these charitable donations to the poor of Dublin, they, in turn, paid off all of Handel's debts. So now let's take a moment to address a little controversy about the title of the work. The title of the work is, quote, Messiah, unquote, not, quote, the Messiah, unquote. It is fairly obvious that Handel intended for the work to be referred to as Handel's Messiah, as in my Messiah, my Lord and Savior, a declaration of faith. But it's an intrinsically problematic title because when one refers to the work in absentia, it's typical to talk about the Messiah, as one would say the Fourth Symphony. So the same word of mouth that advertised the work after this illustrious premiere also added some confusion to the title. And then it doesn't help that here in the States, several prominent publications of the work from the 1940s to the 1960s, printed in the United States, actually printed the title page as, quote, the Messiah, unquote. So people could actually hold up their score and say, see, the Messiah. So now, you know the title is Messiah. But as with anything that you want other people to enjoy, don't be a jerk about it. Leave that to the music snobs who enjoy being jerks. And they do. And while we're talking about publications, it's worth noting that there is not one definitive version because Handel kept revising it. He continuously tinkered with it throughout his lifetime, resulting in multiple official versions from the composer. A year later, after the premiere, in 1743, he began to have vision problems from cataracts. He continued playing and performing and continued composing with various people doing his notations and editing for him. Finally, in 1751, he had cataract surgery that went wrong, causing him permanent blindness. and still he performed. Even during his lifetime, Handel's music was recognized as a reflection of the English national character and his capacity for realizing the common mood. We would say today he had his finger on the pulse of the public taste. The majority of his music is vocal, but he also composed harpsichord work, chamber works, and well-known and well-loved larger instrumental works, such as the water music and music for the royal fireworks. In England, he is staunchly claimed as a British composer, although his German birth and training and his work in Italy both remained essential elements of his compositional style. Many of his compositions have gone on to individual perpetual fame, but few composers have any work as omnipresent and as persistently performed as Messiah. At least the Christmas section is now regularly performed at Christmas time all over the world. The size and scope of the performances would have been absolutely beyond the imagination of Handel. One of the most recent very large ones was a performance by the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, where 2,500 singers submitted themselves virtually to join in possibly the largest performance ever of the Hallelujah Chorus. As fate would have it, the last musical performance that Handel attended was one of Messiah in 1759. He died shortly afterwards. At the time of his death, he had once again amassed a fortune. He left about 20,000 pounds. In today's money, that's about $8 million. Most of it went to his niece in Germany. While doing my research for this, I came across some fun facts provided by Tuffle Music, an original instrument early music performance group that is well known internationally. Their current annual Messiah sing-along at Kerner Hall, the Royal Conservatory in Toronto, has an annual attendance of over 6,000 each year. During the singing of Messiah, the bass section sings the word Hallelujah 44 times. The most frequently used noun in the libretto is Lord, mentioned 26 times. Speaking of which, how many times is Messiah used in the libretto? None. And over the course of the complete 3-hour work, the timpanist plays a total of how many minutes? 4. And finally, how many valves were played on the trumpet during the trumpet will sound? Trick question. None, because Baroque trumpets, like Baroque horns, had no valves. The pitches are all created by a combination of breath control, tongue, lips, and teeth. I'm Cara Dahl Russell. I have written and recorded this biography of Handel specifically for a sing-along performance of the Christmas portion of Messiah held at St. Peter's Episcopal Church in Salisbury, Maryland on December 19th, 2021. This is made possible by the St. Peter's St. Cecelia Guild, and all of my work in the arts this year has been funded with a grant from the Maryland State Arts Council. I will add links to a few complete performances of Messiah at the end of this presentation. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope that it helps add to your appreciation and enjoyment of Handel's Messiah. Thank you.